Okay, I've unmuted myself. So I hope Mr. Mayor is on because I'm on a tablet, so I don't see everybody at one time. Is he here? Oh, awesome. So Archer Mayer is the author of the highly acclaimed Vermont-based series featuring Detective Lieutenant Joe Gunther of the Brattleboro Police Department. The books, which have been appearing about once a year since 1988, have been published in 5 different languages. The Chicago Tribune describes his work as, quote, the best police procedurals being written in America, end quote. He is a past winner of the New England Independent Booksellers Association Award for Best Fiction, the first time that a writer of crime literature has been so honored. Mayer's 22nd Joe Gunther novel, Tagman, earned a place on the New York Times bestseller list for hardback fiction. Interestingly, before turning his hand to fiction, Mr. Mayer wrote history books. Mr. Mayer was brought up in the United States, Canada, and France, and had been employed as a scholarly editor, a researcher for Time Life Books, a political advance man, a theater photographer, a newspaper writer-editor, a lab technician for Paris Match magazine, and a medical illustrator. In addition to writing novels and occasional articles, Mayer gives talks all around the country and has been on the faculty of the Bread Loaf Young Writers Conference in Middlebury, Vermont, and the Colby College Seminar on Forensic Sciences in Waterville, Maine. Archer Mayer is currently a death investigator for Vermont's Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. Over the past 30 years, he has also been a detective for the Windham County Sheriff's Office, a volunteer firefighter EMT, the publisher of his own backlist, and a frequent contributor to magazines and newspapers. Only thing I don't see on there is that he's been a member of the Rotary. Whereas many writers base their books only on interviews and scholarly research, Mayer's novels are based on actual experience in the field. The result adds a depth, detail, and veracity to his characters and their tribulations that has led the New York Times to call him, quote, the boss man on procedures, end quote. May I present to you Archer Mayer.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, and thank you for the flutter. That's very trendy, very teen. I noticed that Marty was the first to indulge, which of course would be completely reasonable and logical. Thank you. You are well advised not to have me as a fellow Rotarian to quote, that almost tiresome quote at this point. You wouldn't, I wouldn't want to be the member of a club that would have me as a member of that club. And I've been unemployed since the late 1970s, and that is for good reason. I play with dead people because I don't play well with live people, which is probably why I've spent the last 40 years writing about how to kill them. So all in all, while I am delighted to render you a visit now and then, which I'm always pleased to do, you really wouldn't want me in your midst. And if you have any doubts about that, take Marty off to one side in a dark and gloomy room and pressure him a little, and it won't take much to have him agree with me on this score. He knows me better than most, and we've played together on a variety of projects over the years, none of which unfortunately have come to fruition, but they've all been fun in the pursuit. I'm obviously someone who does what I do. There is a sort of a quizzical aspect as to why I would be invited to chat with you folks. But in fact, as I've done in the past, I run a business, and so in a funny kind of way, that's as much a part of my personality as anything else. But thank goodness, about 10 years ago, I married a woman who is very business oriented. And so she handles the front end of the office as I used to. It's become ever more complex in this electronic happy world of ours. And as such, I'm delighted to have retired a little bit from the front so that I can concentrate on what has become an interminable series of books. I'm now really, if it hadn't been for a series of dead bodies that have called my attention elsewhere, one of which is my snowblower, by the way, I got lousy mileage for responding to my snowblower's demise, but it was a heartfelt operation. Because of these distractions, I have not yet sent off my 32nd Joe Gunther book to the publisher, but I'll try to do that tomorrow. And that gives you a tiny little glimpse of what life I lead. It's 7 days a week and pretty much 24 hours a day. I write at night, I write it during the daytime. I also do all these other activities. In my prime, I was a law enforcement officer at the same time that I did the death investigations and wrote the books. And to me, everyone else rolls their eyes and goes, "Oh my God, what a terrible schedule." But I was in a happy place there. Of course, I wasn't married, and that is a crucial aspect. Having said that, when it's 11:30 at night and we're about to close up shop and turn out the lights, and my pager goes off, my wife looks at me and rolls her eyes and starts shaking her head, but she stops immediately because my face inevitably lights up with joy, and I head out the door to do an all-nighter. I've done many more all-nighters in my antiquity than I ever did when I was attending college. And so it's a good life for me. It's a life of chaos. It's a life of crisis management. It's a life of never ever knowing how the day is going to proceed, and that includes any kind of writing schedule as well. I don't know why it is, but I seem to like the unscheduled aspects of life, which is, of course, a roundabout way of saying I almost forgot to sign on with you guys, but I made it. um, so, long story short, I don't want to go on and on about writing and whatnot. I would far rather, since there are almost 30 of you on, respond to whatever curiosities you might have. Our time is relatively short. I know that you guys clock off at the straight up hour, and as such, I would far prefer to be of use to you if you have any questions. So to emulate the brag section, if any of you have a question, wave and let Rhonda know, or however you figured out how to make this work in this virtual world of ours, and I'll respond directly to those inquiries.
Arch, do you have any raw material out of the activities of a couple of weeks ago on the 6th that you might incorporate into your future books?
I rarely write about matters that are so grotesquely disorganized. Also, I try not to go below Guilford too terribly often in my peregrinations. Uh, much as I do like to write about people under stress, matters of that degree and of that sort of attention grabbing import, I'm as much an observer as you guys are. Quite frankly, if you've spent as many decades as I have in the company of people, many of whom were present on that day, misbehaving egregiously as they stormed the Capitol steps, you be, I don't want to be a downer here, but I wasn't the least bit surprised that people got stimulated enough to take that action into their own hands. I've spent a lot of time in the company of such people, albeit in far lesser numbers at one time than we got to witness on that unfortunate day. So I miniaturize the process, Carl. What my interest is in why we do what we do. So your question is highly relevant, but it's geographically misplaced. So I miniaturize the process. I go to our humble locale here in Vermont where we think no such misbehavior could occur, but it does in far smaller form all the time. People are easily subverted when it comes to common sense or even polite and rational behavior. And it's sort of my job, not just to be an entertainer, but to describe these things and to uncover them, if you will, to discuss them in the books. I write social anthropologies more than I write murder mysteries. I don't even read murder mysteries. I don't find them terribly interesting if all they are is a good guy, bad guy, car chase. That's kind of boring to me. But I love whodunits. And I would argue that that's probably what I write more than I do whodunits. And as such, I've been writing about the very people that you just touched upon for my entire career.
I suspect so. Rhonda, you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. Archer, when did you write your first book? How did the detective get his name? And how did you formulate your first story? What was your backstory to your first book that you wrote?
The first books I wrote were exercises in typing. If I handed you a piccolo, of course, this is when I discovered that you're actually a concert trained piccolo player. But if I handed you a piccolo, I would suspect that you would just admire its workmanship, but you wouldn't know much about how to play it. Similarly, just because I could operate a typewriter or read and write didn't make me a writer. And therefore, whenever someone approaches me and says, "Oh, I wrote my very first book. What do I do with it now?" I suggest that they burn it. And once I've gotten out of the room alive, uh, I follow that up by telling them that this is great, that you did that one for yourself. Now, continue the process, learn to do it properly, and do it for the rest of us. Because if you can write that first book and if you can understand it in those logical terms and therefore burn it because it's just a training exercise, then you probably have the makings of a real writer. This is a profession. It takes practice. It's no different than the aforementioned piccolo player or anything else that you become good at. So I typed and typed and wrote and I got rejected for very good reasons. And it wasn't basically until 1980 from 1975. So for 5 years, I've been writing these horrible things. I kept them all, by the way, just to remind myself of my humble roots. But in 1980, I was misbegotten, arrogant, and probably tired enough of society that I quit and became a full-fledged professional writer. Uh, at that point, now 40 years ago, I had to hire myself out. My novels were not moving at all. The first Joe Gunther came out in '88 after I'd already written several history books. Histories speak for themselves. You do the research, you put it together, the facts, and you write the book. And the results speak for themselves. And I like to think they're actually pretty good books. They're still, one of them is still very much available from the University of Georgia Press. But in the meantime, I was, as you suggest, sort of segueing or hoping to segue from history to fiction. And I did so fairly ponderously. Joe Gunther did not come full-fledged out of the bag. He was a voice I needed to discover and find and nurture and poke at a little bit. So Open Season, the first book in the series, was written in 3 completely separate editions. And in fact, I did throw the first 2 out. The third and final one that did get published, and what some of you know as the first in the series, was in no way, shape, or form vaguely familiar or similar to its predecessors. But to me, it was a wonderful and final step to my discovering Joe Gunther. Now, Joe Gunther was chosen and named as such because I thought it was possibly the most boring name I could invent. I was tired of people named Remington Steele or James Bond, who always had 3 names: Bond, James Bond. People didn't realize his first name was actually Bond. But I came up with Joe Gunther because I wanted a regular guy. And then I went about, you know, crafting a highly not regular fella. Uh, he sounds like a regular Joe, but let's not kid ourselves. This man is more thoughtful, more avuncular, more of a team player, more helpful to his fellows than most of us, most three of us put together. And that was on purpose. I was tired of anti-heroes, you know, people who had all sorts of excuses for being heroic when in fact their lives were fractured messes of reality. I wanted someone, you know, who was born on a farm of normal parents and had a happy upbringing and all the rest of it. He just happened to turn out to be one of the most decent human beings you're ever going to meet. And he did a regular job. He was a police officer, pure and simple. And I thought to myself, let's see if I can make a hero out of such cloth. And I like to think I did. Now, it was helped by the fact that I surrounded him with a fairly healthy collection of eccentrics. To say that Willie Kunkel is in any way, shape, form, you know, our normal is to stretch things a bit. Having said that, my daughter says I'm much more like Willie Kunkel than I'll ever be like Joe Gunther, but that's parenthetical. And of course, she's my daughter, so she would say that. So that was sort of it in a nutshell. The book began, sort of unfolded as all my books have ever since. So I answer some questions through interviews. I meet a lot of people. I go to a lot of places. Marty's helped me out in this process, in fact. And a perfect case in point is when he sidled up to me at the post office, which is the Vermont version of a bar. And he said, you know, hey, I've been working at Vermont Yankee. What do you say you find a dead body found under the concrete there? And I said, well, by God, that works for me. And I immediately took advantage of his kind graces, went down there, interviewed a few people. And next thing you know, I wrote a book about a body being discovered under the concrete at Vermont Yankee. So I don't have to do a lot of thinking about this. Why I did that is because these are normal everyday events, and my books oftentimes start along such premises. But the questions that I pay my closest attention to are why that body? Why someone killed him? Why did someone disguise him or cover him up? Why done it? Again, we go back to that theme of what stimulates me as a writer is to figure out the rationale underlying all these bizarre and sometimes bloodthirsty actions. I'm also a fairly complicated person, so the plot necessarily becomes fairly convoluted fairly quickly. So from Marty's you know, initial quiet comment, there begat a book of you know, more levels than I could possibly remember. But it was a joy to write, and that's how it started, and that's how open season started. Also, these things often begin quite quietly. And then I write. In fact, I create as I write. A lot of people, they do outlines, they do plots, they have 3x5 cards, they lay everything out, they know exactly how they're going to proceed before they go. I don't do any of that. I have conversations like the one I just regaled you with. I do a lot of the interviews that I mentioned. Things begin to formulate in my head, but they are enough probably to populate 3 or 4 novels. But I'm only doing the one. And therefore, I have far more information in my head than I need. And that's my happy place. So then I begin to write. And I'm just a storyteller. So as I write, I'm telling the story. The characters are filling my head with voices. They are by and large dictating their actions and what evolves as I go. I never know how the book is going to end. I never know how long the book is going to be. And on several occasions, I don't even know who the bad guy is. And therefore, during the editing process, which takes at least as long as the writing process, I will change on those occasions who the bad guy was. I just didn't like, you know, the what I'd done. So you can turn things around and sharpen them up and polish them. It's not unlike woodworking, which I also enjoy doing. You start with very crude materials, but by the end of the day, you end up with a pretty elegant and finished looking product. And that's the writing business also. Did I answer all those questions? I think I got most of them. Okay, good. Marty, you kept raising your hands. I don't know if you're being polite or nervous or if you had a question.
Archer, one of the things that you do is, yes, the murders change, those characters change, but yet 31 books, and I really enjoyed Orphan's Guilt, your number 31.
Thank you.
But I put a free plug in for you that.
Yeah, appreciate that. You'll get your check.
Thank you very much. But how do you keep track of the main characters? Because they've really developed over the 31 years. You know, Joe starting out as working for the Brattleboro Police and now being the head of the Vermont Bureau of Investigation, VBI. But all the other characters, how do you keep track of how they've developed?
It's quite simple. I don't.
Good. Thank you. Next question.
That was easy. No, I don't know why, Marty. It's an interesting thing to me that some folks are really quite keen on that. They keep track, they keep cards, they keep little journals, all the rest of it. J.K. Rowling, well, of course, her world is far more complex than anything I would do, but you know, reams and reams and reams of notebooks of excessive detail about the backgrounds of every one of her characters, including things that you'll never, ever, ever get to read. I don't do any of that. I literally sit down, kind of remember what it is they're up to, and I lead their lives kind of the way I lead my life. And I would argue most of us do too. We forget stuff. We do things of a day that we didn't plan to. Things come out of the blue. But in a funny kind of way, while we pride ourselves on our great individuality and our decisiveness and how we can evolve and change over time, we actually are not that full of surprises to the people who know us best. And as such, my characters, being somewhat rooted in reality, if you will, although not based on real people, they similarly are somewhat predictable. But to your point, I do have a secret weapon. Don't go into great detail. So what do we know about Lester's mother and father? Not a thing, etc. So down the line, what I have adhered to is a golden rule of mine, which is that you, the reader, and I, the writer, are co-conspirators. We tell these stories together. I set out the plot and the characters and whatnot to a certain extent, to a large extent. And when you pick up the book and begin to read, just like all us readers, your movie projector begins in your head and you begin to see scenes that I touch on through suggestion, but I don't describe in intimate detail. And that's certainly true for the characters. And I don't describe what their voices sound like. And yet you have given them voices in your head. So as you progress through the book, you fill in details I don't supply. And that makes you a co-storyteller. And that's exactly where I want you to go, because I want you to be at 11 o'clock at night, longing to go to sleep, but you got to finish that chapter. And why is because you filled yourself with so many details that you want to see to completion. I might as well not even be there, except I am supplying the basic map of the plot and the story. So in a way, I give you more by giving you less. And that keeps me out of trouble by and large. There was that time, of course, when I started research for The Sniper's Wife, which was all about all about Willie Kunkel going back to his roots, and you know, we had to discover what made him tick, and I made a little exception there because I was switching from first person to third person, all this other arcania. And so I began to do my research into Willie's background, and of course I knew that he had been a Boston police officer. Wrong. He was a New York police officer. I'd completely forgotten about that. So I started making phone calls. I want to talk to the Boston PD, but thank God something occurred to me and I went, I better double check on this. I never do this, but I went back to an early book and there was the name New York. And I went, uh-oh. So I switched all those phone calls. Oh boy, you guys would have really lit up if I'd done that. So have I created some mistakes now and then? Probably minor ones, but either you guys are as asleep at the wheel as I am, or I've actually pulled my little sleight of hand off. Um, so,
Do you really use a typewriter?
no longer. I actually still have typewriters. In fact, I was using one this morning, but I use it for. There's sometimes the reports. But I still can't master turning out envelopes on anything other than a typewriter. It's just because I'm an old dog. I don't own a smartphone. There's some semblances of antiquity that I cling to, and the typewriter is one of them. But I write on a computer. And the reason I use a computer to write is because of the editing advantages of a computer. You can cut and paste and slash and move things around. And all of a sudden you realize you've named the same character or two separate characters, Harry, and one needs to be turned into Tom. Boom, a stroke of a few keyboard strokes and you're good to go. It's an invaluable tool and it makes editing, which is, as I mentioned, 50% of my job, that much easier. So I never look back. I was a very, very early purchaser of computers back in the late 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never looked back. Yeah.
We're getting close to our time. So maybe I see, Bill, you have a question?
Yeah, well, I want to congratulate Archer because I'm a kind of a non-reader because I'm dyslexic. It takes me a long time to read stuff, and I just enjoy being part of the stories that Archer you've produced, because there isn't a lot of the descriptive detail that sort of chains me to the page, and I want to tell you I really appreciate that. And everything else, of course. But so keep it up. Thank you.
Oh, well, you're very kind. And I greatly appreciate that, Bill. Thank you very much. My father trained me, old Yankee that he was, say it well, keep it brief, and get the hell out.
Mara?
I just want to make a $10 brag. When I moved here, it was the fall of 1989, and in my gift basket from the board was the requisite maple syrup and open season. So I brought it home and read it that night.
Yeah.
And the line that was most memorable to me, so this goes to the fact that I think that your books go beyond the craft of storytelling and into another level. You had a description of 91, which I had never driven past Brattleboro in my interviews. And you said that it unspooled like a black ribbon following the contours of the land. And the first time I drove to Montpelier, I'm like, my God, that's exactly what it is. And every time I drive that road, I think of that one line, that one thought of Joe Gunther's. It was so like poetic. I mean, the words weren't poetic, the thought was poetic. And it has stayed with me for decades now. So this $10 for you.
Right. Well, you're very kind, Mara, and I thank you very much. And it's a nice note to close on because in addition to entertainment and perhaps a little reflection on our own environs, it matters an extraordinary amount to me to say it well. Music is my language. I'm sorry, language is my music. Obviously not in that instance. And I do my utmost to try to deliver a melodious tune to you. So thank you for noticing.
Well, thank you for coming and having a conversation with us rather than, speaking to us. It was a great time. Thank you. And have a great day. We'll end our meeting on that note and talk to you next week.